Now you have scoured the entire internet and all the YouTube announcements on the new Sonos Arc Ultra that was just announced, and you just cannot find enough information on whether to pre-order, to upgrade, or to get a new soundbar to enhance your movie watching experience. Now today, I'm going to help you make that decision. Now, short upfront summary like in my videos, this is going to be an expensive video to watch, about $1,000 worth of it. Now I have to give you a brief of what the original Sonos Arc is all about. Now when the Sonos Arc Ultra was launched, it was named Ultra. It wasn't named the Arc Gen 2 because it is not actually a Gen 2. It's not a reiteration of the product. It's not a refinement to the original Arc. It is a completely new soundbar from ground up, and I will explain that in just a while, so stay around. Now the Sonos Arc Gen 1 has 11 drivers powered by 11 individual Class D amplifiers, and these 11 drivers are broken down into 8 mid-bass drivers and 3 tweeters. The Sonos Arc Ultra, on the other hand, has 14 drivers powered by, strangely, 15 Class D digital amplifiers. Now, how does that work? Now, let me give you a run through. So instead of the 8 mid-bass drivers, the Arc Ultra now only has 6 mid-bass drivers. Instead of the original 3 tweeters, it now has 7 tweeters. So that configuration has completely changed. So if you look inside the Arc Ultra, it is a completely different soundbar. The configuration of the drivers are all completely different, and I haven't gone down to the 14th driver, which for the bass is actually the sound motion driver. Now we have to explain the sound motion driver in just a while so that you can appreciate what is going on. But before we do that, let's take a look at the configuration of all these 11 and all these 14 drivers in the Arc Ultra. Now for the Arc Gen 1, the left channel has 1 mid and 1 tweeter, and the right channel has 1 mid and 1 tweeter. The center channel has 2 mid-bass drivers and 1 tweeter. So if you total up for the front sound stage of left, center, and right, there are 4 mid-bass drivers and 3 tweeters. Now for the surrounds firing off to the sides of the Sonos Arc 1, you have 2 mids. And for the heights channel, there are 2 upward firing drivers, again 2 mid-bass drivers. So these complete the 11 drivers for the Arc Gen 1. Now for the Arc Ultra, the configuration has changed. For the left, center, and right, they all have 2 mid-bass drivers and 1 tweeter firing for each of these channels. The surround, instead of using 2 mid-bass drivers, it is now using 2 tweeters. And for the highs, it is using 2 tweeters instead of 2 mid-bass drivers. So this configuration is 6 mid drivers and 7 tweeters for a total of 13. And for the bass, which actually wasn't available in the Arc Gen 1, the Arc Ultra now has the sound motion driver. And this sound motion driver is one compact unit on its own using the hard motion technology that was acquired by Sonos from buying Mayer back in 2022. So this solution, this technology has now made its way into the Arc Ultra. So all this is very confusing until I put it in a table so they can see and very clearly understand what the differences are. So if you look at this table right here, you'll see that the left and the right channel of the Arc Ultra now has 1 extra mid driver firing forward. The center is unchanged, so it's still 2 mid and 1 tweeter. And for the surrounds and the heights, you'll see that instead of using mid-bass drivers as in the Arc 1, the Arc Ultra are now using tweeters instead. So all the bass duties, so you've got less mid-bass drivers, and you would think that for the Arc Ultra, you'll get slightly less mid-bass, but the mid-bass drivers in the Arc Gen 1, they also had bass duties, whereas in the Arc Ultra, they don't really have the bass duties because the bass duties are now assigned to the sound motion driver. So this is why I say the Arc Ultra might as well be a completely different soundbar altogether. There are almost no similarities between the Arc Gen 1 and the Arc Ultra, save for the center array, which still has 2 mid and 1 tweeter. So the configurations of throwing sound around for the surrounds and the highs are now relegated to tweeters rather than mid-bass drivers. So one thing we need to understand here is that higher frequencies produced by the tweeters are actually more directional than the mid-bass frequencies that are produced by the mid-bass woofers. And case in point, if you watch Ghost Protocol, I think this is the Tom Cruise, one of the Mission Impossible movies. There was one part in the corridor where they were trying to infiltrate, I don't know, I think it was some Russian facility, where they were using this cone to simulate a drop of water, right, to confuse the guard. And this is where it is, right? So you can tell that the higher frequencies, they are easier to direct than the lower frequencies. Now, this is where the surrounds and the highs are being directed in the Sonos Arc Ultra. So bass frequencies, on the other hand, those produced by the sound motion driver, which has been relegated the bass duties in the Sonos Arc Ultra, they are more encompassing. You can't really locate where the bass is coming from. It is not as directional as the higher frequency drivers. So the bass architecture of the Arc Ultra is to use the tweeters to direct the sound, and therefore giving you the impression of 9.1.4, 9 horizontal channels, being the front stage of left, center, right, and the front wides, as well as the rear surrounds and the side surrounds. So altogether 9 channels. And the top firing channels are being played by the 2 tweeters, which I don't know how to do the 4 heights channel, 0.4. And the 0.1 in the middle of 9.1.4 is the bass, which basically the sound motion driver is supposed to take the place of the subwoofer. So in one soundbar unit, the Arc Ultra on its own, it is able to play 9.1.4. How effectively? We don't know. We have to wait for the unit to come before we review it. So earlier you have heard me mention that there are 14 drivers, right? So if you look at the chart, yes, the Arc Ultra has 14 drivers, and each of the mid-bass driver and the tweeters are being powered by one individual Class D amplifier. So that makes 13, right? And then there is one sound motion driver, which is the 14th driver, but there are still 2 more digital amplifiers available. So my guess is that the sound motion driver actually takes up 2 of the digital amplifier. Now we have to understand a little bit about how the sound motion driver works and why is it worth extra $100. Now I don't want to say that you're paying $100 for the sound motion driver, because the Sonos Arc Ultra is a completely different machine altogether. It's a different soundbar altogether if you look at how the whole architecture is working, right? So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what the sound motion driver is. Now, if you look at this short animation of how the sound motion driver works, is that there are 2 opposing surfaces, right? One firing upwards and one firing downwards. And they squeeze this whole unit into the soundbar itself. Now, this whole soundbar is slightly wider, but it is actually shorter and it is not as deep as the Sonos Arc Gen 1, which is a technological marvel. How did they manage to squeeze so many things into one soundbar? But this sound motion driver, it sits right there horizontally, and it fires the 2 surfaces up and down in opposing directions so that it reduces the amount of vibration. Now, these drivers are being powered by 4 small individual motors, 4 distributed lightweight motors. Now, traditional speakers, right? Maybe just take this as the cone. This is the cone of the speaker, and you have a motor behind. The magnets are behind, the voice coils are behind, and it pushes the diaphragm forward and backwards to create sound waves. And this is how a traditional speaker driver works. But for the case of this particular sound motion driver, the motor is no longer sitting behind. The motors are actually distributed to the edges, right? It is moved from the back to the edges, right? So you can imagine a small rectangular unit here, and instead of the motor sitting right here, it is sitting at the 4 corners. There are a couple of things, right? So they say that these are lightweight motors, and this actually allows Sonos to move the motors to the side so that it can flatten the sound motion unit. And this is important because we don't have a lot of space in the soundbar, do we? So the whole thing is being held together by high performance plastic suspension. It makes the transducer more durable. I mean, I don't know how that works, and from the way I see it, these are guides to move the diaphragm back to space. Now, there are aluminum ribs connecting the motor, so I would guess that those are the two different parts on the whole sound motion unit, and reinforcing force cancelling cones. So the cones, they are not flat, they are not like a regular speaker where it is smooth or a round bulge in the middle. It is actually reinforced, and there are like cross ribs across the entire surface. Now these four motors, it actually four pairs of opposing magnets, powering 4 voice coils for bigger sound in a smaller package. Now all these are their marketing speak, but how it actually works is that, well, basically it takes the motor away from the center of the driver, move it to the side so that it is more compact and smaller and can fit right into the soundbar. And how the sound radiates from the soundbar is that it pushes the air up and downwards, right, in opposing fashion, so that there's no vibration and your soundbar won't be jumping up and down. So what this does is it produces all the bass frequency that the Arc Ultra will need, and this relieves the Arc Ultra from having to use the mid-bass drivers from driving any bass frequency. Any bass that you need from the Sonos Arc Ultra is going to come from the sound motion unit. So why does this work for the Arc Ultra? What was the problem with the original Arc Gen 1? Now, I don't want to say that there's a problem with the Arc Gen 1 because on its own, without the Arc Ultra on the landscape, the Arc sounded really good anyway. Now, the thing is that it has to produce bass on its own. Now, all soundbars suffer from this. It's not just the Arc. There simply just isn't enough cabinet space to produce the bass. You cannot best physics if you want low-end sub 50 Hz bass, right? You need room for the big waves to come out of the enclosure. So, how does the Arc Ultra solve it? Well, with the sound motion unit, because now you have a driver that is not limited to the size of the soundbar, which is only barely 3.5 inches high. So if you look at all the mid-bass drivers that was in the Arc Gen 1, they are limited to a slightly elliptical shaped 3.5-inch drivers pushing the bass out. So the Arc Gen 1, when it first launched, it had problem producing bass at about 40 Hz. Now, no soundbar should be made to produce bass at 40 Hz, but it was tuned to do it, and therefore they came up with some wobble and there were some issues with the Sonos Arc Gen 1 at launch back in June of 2020. They later solved it by retuning the sound so that you're not asking so much bass from the Sonos Arc soundbar itself. Now, if you wanted bass, yes, you add a subwoofer, either the Sub Gen 3 or the earlier versions or the Sub Mini, and it will take away the bass duties from the Sonos Arc Gen 1. But for the Sonos Arc Ultra, you actually are able to produce bass from the sound motion unit. Now, is it able to go down to 50 Hz, 40 Hz? We don't know for sure right now, but all we know is that being driven by the two individual Class D amplifiers for the 4 voice coils, it should be able to move those two diaphragms out with enough surface area to produce the lower frequency sound. Now, if the sound motion unit were to produce more bass, thus doing away with less mid-bass units, the power of the Arc can be used to drive the 7 tweeters, giving higher frequencies more directions. Now, higher frequencies are definitely more directional. Remember Ghost Protocol, Mission Impossible? Now, so what about the bass? Now, more of it is going to be thrown to the sound motion unit, which radiates bass rather than try to direct the bass, right? So you will notice that probably the whole soundbar, the Sonos Arc Ultra, is going to have a much wider soundstage, but maybe it might suffer from a little bit less mid-bass, although the lower end bass, maybe 50 Hz and below, is probably going to sound a little bit better. Now, you may be asking, what if you already have a subwoofer? Because there's a sound motion unit in the Sonos Arc Ultra itself. The crossover point can then be set lower, not necessarily at the previous 110 Hz or so, because the Sonos Arc, the Gen 1, probably was handing the sub duties over to the sub at a crossover point at about 110 Hz. Meaning to say the Arc itself was able to play the sounds above 110 Hz and below 110 Hz, it will pass them off over to the subwoofer. Now, for the Arc Ultra, if the Arc Ultra itself is able to produce better bass at a lower frequency, That means that the subwoofer will never ever need to produce any sound above 80 Hz. If the cutover is set to 80 Hz, the Arc Ultra will be able to produce the sounds above 80 Hz, thus only relegating the sounds below 80 Hz to the subwoofer. Now, this will completely isolate vocals coming from the sub, because male vocals, especially the deep ones, sometimes it gets directed, a little bit of it bleeds over to the sub when the crossover point is set at 110 Hz. So with the Sonos Arc Ultra, hopefully the whole crossover point is set a little bit lower, and you can then completely isolate vocals, which becomes distracting when it's coming from the sub. So I do suspect overall the Sonos Arc Ultra will have sound that is more directional, thus the claim of 9.1.4. It basically is a full Atmos soundbar. The mid-bass might drop out a little bit, but it will be compensated by the Sound Motion unit, putting out more low-end bass. I am really excited to test this, and I want to see whether my perceived improvements pan out in the Arc Ultra. So stay tuned while we wait for the delivery of the Sonos Arc Ultra. And if you have missed the announcement of the Sonos Arc Ultra together with the Sub Gen 4, check out this video right here, and I'll see you in one of those videos.